The air on Xylos hummed, a low, constant thrum of unseen energies that resonated deep in the bones. It was a world saturated with life, a planet-sized terrarium where evolution had run riot in a palette of phosphorescence and crystalline flora. Towering, translucent spires of what passed for trees clawed at a sky the color of bruised plums, their inner veins glowing with a soft, internal light. Under a canopy of massive, gently pulsing fungi, the diplomatic pavilion had been erected. It was not built, but grown from the very substance of the planet, a seamless dome of living, pearlescent material that swirled with faint, shifting colors. Inside, Ambassador Evelyn Reed took a slow, deliberate breath, the alien air tasting of ozone and sweet decay. She smoothed a non-existent crease in her formal diplomatic tunic, her gaze sweeping over the chamber. Her hosts, the Lumina, stood in a silent, graceful arc. They were tall, impossibly slender beings, their bodies composed of a fibrous, semi-translucent material that resembled spun glass. Their limbs moved with a liquid grace, and their elongated heads, featureless save for three large, obsidian-dark eyes, tilted with an unnerving synchronicity. Their skin, if it could be called that, shimmered with a soft, internal bioluminescence, a pale blue that bespoke a state of calm curiosity. They communicated through a complex series of chimes and harmonic resonances, which a small, silver disc pinned to Reed's collar translated into crisp, monotone English. "We welcome you, Ambassador of Humanity," resonated the voice of the lead Lumina, whose name translated to Xyler. His personal luminescence was a slightly deeper shade of azure, indicating his status. "May this convergence bring forth understanding and a harmonious joining. On behalf of the Terran Federation, we are honored to be here, Elder Xyler," Reed replied, her voice warm and steady. "Your world is breathtaking. We hope this is the first step in a long and prosperous relationship." A mountain of quiet stillness in human form, stood Security Chief Elias Thorne. Where Reed was all polished diplomacy, Thorne was weathered practicality. His face was a roadmap of past hardships, his eyes the color of storm clouds, and they missed nothing. He was not looking at the Lumina diplomats, but past them, at the juncture where the pavilion met the jungle floor, at the shadows that danced just beyond the glowing perimeter. His presence was a silent, non-negotiable statement. "We come in peace, but we are not defenseless. You honor us with your presence," Xyler chimed, the translator rendering the complex harmonics into simple words. "To commemorate this moment, we have prepared a feast. A sharing of sustenance is the first bond of trust. We offer you the pinnacle of our nourishment, the essence of life, refined to its most perfect form." With a gesture from Xyler, several smaller Lumina glided forward. They carried trays of the same pearlescent material as the pavilion, upon which rested small, perfectly formed cubes. Each cube glowed with a faint, internal golden light, shimmering as if containing a tiny, captured star. They emitted no scent, no heat. They were sterile, geometric, and absolute. "This is Synth Prime," Xyler explained, his own blue light brightening with pride. "All the required amino acids, nutrients, and energy for a sentient organism, replicated at the molecular level. It is sustenance without consequence. No life must be ended, no organism must be harmed. It is purity. It is harmony." Reed smiled, a masterclass in polite diplomacy. She knew this moment was coming. The initial data packets had been clear on Lumina philosophy. They had transcended the messy, inefficient process of biological consumption millennia ago, evolving to draw energy directly from their planet's unique radiation, and supplementing with this, sterile perfection. "Elder Xyler, the gesture is profound, and we are deeply grateful," she began, choosing her words with the care of a bomb disposal expert. "However, human physiology is particular. We have evolved over millions of years within a complex, competitive biosphere. Our digestive systems are designed for processing intricate organic structures. While this is undoubtedly pure, our bodies would likely fail to recognize it as sustenance." It was a masterful half-truth. They could probably survive on nutrient paste, but it was a miserable existence, and more importantly, it was not who they were. A ripple of soft violet, the color of confusion, passed through the assembled Lumina. Xyler's three eyes blinked in slow succession. "Fail to recognize, but it is perfect. The composition is flawless." is a subjective term, Elder, Reed said gently. To our biology, perfection lies in complexity, in the chaotic, wonderful mess of life itself. She glanced at Thorne, a fleeting, almost imperceptible signal. He gave a single, slow nod. Perhaps, Reed continued, turning her attention back to Xyler, to truly demonstrate the bond of trust, we could offer to share a meal in our own fashion, a demonstration of human self-sufficiency and our own relationship with our environment. Xyler's light shifted from violet to a pale, inquisitive green. You would create your own sustenance. Here, we would procure it, Thorne's voice rumbled, the first time he had spoken. It was a low, gravelly sound that seemed to absorb the ambient hum of the room, from the surrounding environment. With your permission, of course. Lumina looked at each other, their internal lights flickering in a silent, rapid-fire conversation. The idea was utterly alien to them. Procure, from the vibrant, harmonious ecosystem just outside. The concept of taking from the whole was antithetical to their entire existence. You mean you would consume the local flora? Xyler asked, the translator tinged with a note of caution. Reed opened her mouth to clarify, but Thorne was faster. His directness was a tool just as her diplomacy was. The flora and perhaps the fauna, we are omnivores, we eat both plants and animals. A wave of deep purple, a color of distinct unease, washed over the lumina. The chimes from the collective became subtly discordant. Fauna, Xyler repeated, as if the word was a foreign object in his mouth. You would end the life of a creature. To sustain our own, Reed said smoothly, stepping in to soften the blow. It is the cycle of which we are a part. One life feeds another. To us, there is no shame in this. It is a fundamental truth of our origin. Xyler was silent for a long moment. The logical, harmonious framework of the meeting had been fractured. This was an unexpected variable. His mandate was to assess the humans, to understand their potential as partners in the galactic community. To refuse their first cultural offering, no matter how bizarre, would be a diplomatic failure. Curiosity, a powerful driver in a species that had solved most of its own mysteries, won out over apprehension. We grant permission, Xyler chimed at last, the decision made. We are curious to observe this ritual. It is a facet of your nature we must understand. You elder, Reed said, relief washing over her. The first and perhaps highest hurdle had been cleared. Chief Thorne and his team will be as respectful to your world as possible. Simply nodded again. He turned to the two other members of his security detail, a man and a woman who had stood with the same quiet intensity. Kowalski, Jiao, gear check, we're going hunting. Lumina watched as the three humans moved to the edge of the pavilion. They produced no advanced weaponry, no plasma rifles or sonic disruptors. Instead, Thorne knelt, running his hand over the strange, fibrous wood of a fallen branch near the jungle's edge. He drew a simple carbon steel knife from his belt, a tool, not a weapon of war, and began to test the wood's properties. Kowalski, a burly man with a quiet focus, began stripping lengths of tough, vine-like creepers. Jiao, lithe and precise, started selecting thin, straight saplings, sighting down them with a practiced eye. To Xyler and the others, it was a bewildering sight. These beings, who had crossed the unfathomable void between stars, were now squatting in the dirt, fashioning primitive implements. Thorne was shaping a spearhead from a shard of obsidian-like rock he'd broken from an outcrop, painstakingly chipping away at it with a smaller stone. Kowalski was weaving the vines into a powerful bowstring, while Jiao was fletching arrows with wide, stiff leaves. The process was methodical, efficient, and strangely silent. The humans worked with an economy of motion that spoke of deep, instinctual knowledge. There was no wasted effort, no hesitation. It was a craft, ancient and ingrained. Xyler turned to his second-in-command, a Lumina named Lyra whose light was a soft silver. Their archives spoke of a history of internal conflict, of primitive eras. I had assumed they had evolved beyond such things, yet they revert to it with such ease. It is not a reversion, Elder, Lyra's translated voice noted, a tremor of something new in her harmonic tone. Observe their hands. The movements are not clumsy or remembered, they are practiced. It is a skill they have retained. The hour they were armed. Thorne held a long, perfectly balanced spear, its stone head wicked and sharp. Jiao had a bow and a dozen arrows. Kowalski held a heavier, thicker spear, his role clearly that of close support. They looked less like diplomats from an advanced civilization and more like figures from a prehistoric ethnograph. "We will return before your primary celestial body sets," Thorn said to Reed, his voice low. "Be safe, Elias," she replied. He gave her a look that was both reassurance and a promise. Then, with a final glance at the watchful, glowing aliens, he, Zhao, and Kowalski stepped out of the light of the pavilion and were swallowed by the deep, phosphorescent gloom of the Xylan jungle. Xyler ordered a silent, high-altitude drone to follow them, its feed displayed on a shimmering cascade of light within the pavilion. He and the other Lumina gathered to watch. The cultural curiosity had now become a source of profound, unsettling fascination. They were about to witness, for the first time in their recorded history, the act of predation, performed by beings who sought to be their friends. The jungle of Xylos was a cathedral of alien life. Light was not merely an overhead phenomenon, it was the very fabric of the ecosystem. Fungi the size of terrestrial armchairs pulsed with a gentle turquoise light, casting eerie, shifting shadows. Trees with bark like shattered crystal refracted the glow, scattering rainbows across the damp, mossy floor. The air itself was thick with glowing spores that drifted like lazy snowflakes, and the constant, low hum was the collective biosonance of a billion living things. For the humans, it was a sensory overload, but not an incapacitating one. They moved through the alien forest with a quiet confidence that baffled the watching Lumina. Xyler, staring at the shimmering datafall from the drone, saw only chaos. The light was disorienting, the sounds a cacophony. His analytical models predicted the humans would be quickly lost or overwhelmed. Yet they were not. Thorn led the way, his movements fluid and economical. He was not merely walking. He was flowing through the environment, his eyes constantly scanning not just ahead but up, down, and to the sides. He was reading the jungle. A bent frond here, a patch of disturbed glowing moss there. To Xyler's processors, these were random data points. To Thorn, they were a sentence. Something passed this way, it was heavy, it was recent. "Hold," Thorn said, his voice a low whisper that barely disturbed the air. Zhao and Kowalski froze instantly, becoming living statues. Thorn knelt, his fingers hovering over a set of tracks pressed into the soft soil. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, a trio of crescent-shaped indentations for each of the creature's 6 feet. "Shimmer hide," Zhao whispered, her eyes scanning the dense undergrowth ahead. The pre-mission briefing had included ecological data gathered by probes. The shimmerhide was a large herbivore, named for its remarkable hide, which was composed of thousands of tiny, crystalline platelets that refracted light, creating a near-perfect camouflage. "Big one," Kowalski grunted, gesturing with his chin at the depth of the tracks. 300 kilos, maybe more. The datafall in the pavilion, Xyler watched the exchange, the translation rendered flatly. The speed of their assessment was startling. They had gleaned more from a patch of dirt in 10 seconds than his probe's atmospheric analysis had in a week. Lyra chimed, her silver light flickering. "The patterns are statistically insignificant. How can they be certain?" "They are not using statistics," Ambassador Reed said, her voice calm and measured. She had chosen to stand with the Lumina to narrate if necessary. She felt it was crucial they didn't misinterpret what they were seeing. "They are using experience, an instinct honed over hundreds of thousands of years. They see the story the environment is telling." Xyler's light pulsed a skeptical violet. "Instinct is a primitive motivator. Logic is superior." "Is it?" Reed countered gently. "Your logic told you they would be lost. Their instinct has found a path." The human team moved on, now with a renewed purpose. They were no longer exploring, they were stalking. Their entire posture had changed. They were lower to the ground, their steps impossibly silent. They moved not as 3 individuals, but as a single, coordinated unit, communicating with hand signals and glances that were too quick for the Lumina to fully process. Thorn held up a hand, and they melted into the shadows behind a colossal, pulsating mushroom. He pointed. About 50 meters ahead, in a small clearing where the glowing spores were thickest, was the creature. The drone zoomed in, and a collective, soft chime of appreciation went through the Lumina. The shimmerhide was magnificent. It was roughly the size of a large terrestrial moose, but with 6 powerful legs, a long, graceful neck, and a head adorned with a crest of crystalline horns that caught the ambient light and splintered it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Its hide lived up to its name, rippling with shifting patterns of light that made it blend seamlessly with the glowing flora. It was currently stripping the bark from a crystal wood tree, its movements serene and peaceful. It was a perfect component of the Xylan harmony. "Beautiful animal," Reed said, her voice soft with genuine admiration. "It is a nexus of life," Xyler agreed. "It cultivates the spores as it feeds. It is essential." "It is," he trailed off as he saw the look on Thorne's face through the drone's high-resolution optics. It was not a look of admiration. It was not a look of malice, either. It was a look of intense, absolute focus. The look of a mathematician solving a complex equation. He was assessing angles, wind drift from the spore clouds, the creature's posture, the location of its vital organs. "Gio, you have the clearest shot," Thorne whispered. "Aim for the primary thoracic cavity just behind the first forelimb. Kowalski, be ready to pin it if she only wounds it. I'll flank left and draw its attention if it bolts our way." The instructions were cold, precise, and anatomical. They were discussing the beautiful, living creature, as if it were a machine with a critical design flaw they were about to exploit. In the pavilion, the air grew thick with tension. The Lumina's bioluminescence had dimmed to a nervous, flickering purple. They were watching a predator-prey diorama unfold, and for the first time they were identifying with the prey. Jiao nocked an arrow, her movements slow and deliberate. She drew the bowstring back to her cheek, her breath held. The drone's microphone picked up the faint creak of the handmade bow. For a long, silent moment, the only movement in the entire jungle seemed to be the gentle drift of the spores and the shimmer hide's serene chewing. Then Jiao loosed the arrow. It flew true, a dark streak against the glowing backdrop. It struck the shimmer hide with a sickening thud, exactly where Thorne had indicated. The creature let out a high-pitched cry, a sound that was not a chime or a resonance but a raw shriek of pain and shock. The sound physically jolted the lumina in the pavilion. Their lights flashed a bright, panicked violet. The shimmerhide staggered, its camouflage flickering as its nervous system went into shock. It tried to run, its powerful legs scrambling for purchase, but the arrow had found its mark. The beautiful animal took 3 stumbling steps, then collapsed onto its side, its crystalline horns digging into the soft earth. A dark, viscous fluid, its blood, began to pool around it, extinguishing the glow of the mosses it soaked into. Kowalski's spear had been ready, but it was not needed. The kill was clean, efficient, merciful in its own brutal way. The 3 humans waited for a full minute, watching for any sign of movement. When there was none, Thorne gave a short, sharp nod. They emerged from the shadows and approached the fallen creature. On the datafall, Xyler watched as Thorne knelt beside the shimmerhide's head. He did not offer a prayer or a moment of reverence. He placed 2 fingers on its large, dark eye, pulling the lid shut. It was a gesture of finality, not of respect. It was the act of closing a book that has been read. "It is done," Lyra chimed, her voice thin and reedy. "The harmony is broken." Reed took a slow breath. "No, Elder Lyra, the cycle is completed. Now they will show you the next part." Mood in the pavilion was no longer one of curiosity. It had curdled into a thick, palpable dread. The Lumina stared at the screen, at the 3 small figures standing over their massive, lifeless prize, and they felt a cold, alien emotion creep into their collective consciousness. It was a feeling their species had not needed to experience for eons, an artifact of a primitive past they had locked away. It was fear. They had invited predators to their feast, and they had just witnessed the hunt. The part that came next, they were beginning to realize, would be far worse. The journey back to the pavilion was a grim procession. Kowalski, with his brute strength, had fashioned a crude travois from branches and vines, and he and Thorne dragged the massive carcass of the shimmerhide through the glowing jungle. The creature's head lolled, its crystalline horns scraping against the alien soil, leaving a trail of disturbed moss and terrified silence in their wake. The smaller creatures of the jungle, the chittering, flitting things that filled the air with sound, had all gone quiet. The scent of blood, a concept so foreign to this ecosystem that it acted as a universal alarm, hung heavy in the air. Jiao walked ahead, her bow unstrung, her eyes scanning their path. Her job was done, but her alertness remained. It was a state of being, not a task, When they emerged from the tree line, they were met with a wall of silence. The gentle, humming welcome from before was gone. The lumina stood clustered together near the center of the dome, their collective light a bruised, murky purple. Even the pavilion itself seemed to have dimmed, its pearlescent walls reflecting the somber mood. Ambassador Reed stood apart from them, her expression carefully neutral, but her posture was tense. She knew this was the most critical phase. Thorne and Kowalski dragged the carcass into the center of the chamber, the scraping sound echoing in the cavernous space. They laid it on a large, clean tarp they had brought with them, a patch of stark Terran utility in the middle of the organic, alien architecture. The sheer physicality of the dead animal was an offense in this sterile environment. Its fur was matted with dark blood, its limbs were limp, and its open mouth revealed a thick, purple tongue. Zyler's 3 eyes were fixed on the body. This is what you require," he chimed, the translator struggling to find a tone for his discordant harmonics. It sounded like grinding glass. "This wreckage." "This is sustenance," Thorne replied, his voice flat. He was already wiping his hands on a cloth, preparing for the next step. "Now we prepare it," he turned to Reed. "Ambassador, perhaps you could explain the process. The elder seems disturbed." "Of course, Chief," she said, then turned to Zyler. Her voice was calm, pedagogical, like a professor explaining a difficult concept. "Elder Zyler, what you are about to see may seem brutal, but I ask you to see it not as desecration, but as a form of respect. To a hunter, wasting a kill is the greatest dishonor. Every part of the animal will be used. This is not an act of rage, but of skill. It is our way of honoring the life that has been given to sustain ours." Zyler did not respond. His light flickered weakly. He could not reconcile the word honor with the scene before him. Thorne and his team worked with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing in its horror. They produced a roll of well-used tools. Knives of varying sizes and shapes, a small cleaver, a honing steel. The implements were worn, cared for, their handles smooth from years of use. These were not ceremonial objects. They were the tools of a trade. Thorne made the first cut, a long, deep incision down the belly of the shimmerhide. The lumina physically recoiled, a wave of violet light washing over them. The sound of the knife parting the flesh was sharp, wet, and utterly profane in the quiet dome. There was no wasted motion. Jiao and Kowalski worked alongside Thorne, a silent ballet of butchery. They peeled back the magnificent, shimmering hide with practiced ease, laying it carefully to one side. Thorne's commentary was quiet, technical, directed at his team, but audible to all. "Get the loins and backstraps. Clear cuts. Kowalski, start on the forelimbs. The shoulder joints look similar to cervid anatomy. Watch for the ligament attachments." "Liver is massive," Jiao noted, her hands, covered in dark blood, working deep inside the creature's body cavity. She expertly severed the organ and lifted it out. It was a deep maroon, glistening under the pavilion's light. "Looks healthy. High iron content, I'd bet." "We'll need that," Thorne grunted, his own arms buried to the elbows as he detached the massive rib cage. The sound of bone being separated from cartilage was a dull, cracking noise that made several of the younger lumina turn their lights away entirely. They were disassembling the creature. It was no longer an animal. It was a collection of parts. Muscle groups were separated with surgical precision, the silver skin and fascia trimmed away. Organs were removed, inspected, and sorted onto separate sections of the tarp. Heart, liver, kidneys. The stomach and intestines were carefully tied off and removed to be dealt with later, away from the prime cuts of meat. To the humans, it was a display of profound skill. Thorne's knowledge of anatomy was incredible. He could identify the purpose and quality of each muscle with a single touch. They worked cheerfully, their conversation sprinkled with the casual jargon of their craft. "Look at the marbling on this," Kowalski said, holding up a large section of muscle from the hindquarter. "This is going to be incredibly tender." "We can use the hide for anything?" Jiao asked, scraping the last bits of flesh from the shimmering pelt. "It's tough but flexible." "Maybe," Thorne said. "But first, the feast." The lumina, this was the ultimate horror. The humans were not just predators, they were butchers. They were taking a beautiful, living being, a part of the world's harmony, and reducing it to a pile of bloody meat. And they were happy about it. Their demeanor was not somber or regretful. It was professional, efficient, and content. They were discussing the flesh of the dead creature the way Illumina might discuss the pleasing resonance of a particular crystal formation. Xyler felt a wave of something akin to nausea, a systemic rejection of the reality he was witnessing. The polite, intelligent, starfaring beings he had greeted hours ago were now standing ankle-deep in gore, cheerfully discussing which parts of the corpse would be most delicious. You are monsters," a young Lumina chimed, its light flickering a frantic, terrified red. The translator delivered the words with a stark finality. Ambassador Reed turned to the distraught alien. Her face was grim, but her voice remained even. "No, we are human, and it is vital that you understand the difference." She walked over to stand beside Xyler, forcing him to look away from the grisly work and meet her eyes. "Elder, your species evolved in a world of plenty, of ambient energy. You had no need to compete, no need to kill to survive. Your evolution selected for harmony, for cooperation, for logic. It is a noble path, and we admire it." She gestured towards Thorn and his team. "Our evolution took a different path. Our world was and is a place of scarcity and competition. For millions of years, we were not the strongest or the fastest. We survived because we were the smartest, the most adaptable, and the most relentless. We learned to hunt not just out of hunger but to outthink our prey and our competitors. That instinct," she said, her voice dropping, "is not something we have shed. It is the very core of who we are. It is the engine of our innovation, our ambition, our refusal to accept limitations. It is the engine of death," Xyler resonated, his voice trembling. "You bring termination. You are an entropy that walks and thinks." "We are a part of the cycle," Reed insisted. "Everything dies, Elder. The stars themselves die. Your philosophy seeks to ignore this truth. Ours embraces it. We understand that from death comes new life. This creature's energy will now become our energy. It will fuel our thoughts, repair our cells, and empower us to continue our journey to the stars. We are not ending a life. We are transferring it." Her words, logical and calm, did nothing to soothe the visceral horror. The Lumina did not see a transfer of energy. They saw a beautiful whole shattered into bloody pieces by smiling, efficient killers. They saw a species that had mastered the physics of star travel, but still carried the soul of a pack of wolves. Thorn, having separated the choicest cuts of meat, looked up. He walked over to a clear space and, with a few practiced motions, began to build a fire. He used a simple friction drill, another primitive skill he had apparently retained. Soon, a small, crackling fire was alive in the center of the alien dome. The Lumina stared at the naked, uncontrolled chemical reaction with fresh terror. It was chaotic, hot, and wild, everything their culture was not. The humans skewered cuts of the dark, rich meat on sharpened sticks, and began to roast them over the flames. And then came the smell. It was a scent that had never before existed on Xylos. The rich, savory, and undeniably carnal aroma of roasting meat. It filled the pavilion, a thick, greasy, and primal smell that was an assault on the senses of a species that subsisted on pure, clean energy. It was the smell of cooked flesh, of rendered fat, of death made delicious. The humans gathered around the fire, their faces lit by the flickering flames. They took the cooked meat, blew on it to cool it, and ate. They ate with a gusto that was both horrifying and mesmerizing. Their faces showed pure, uncomplicated pleasure. "Thorn, you magnificent bastard," Kowalski mumbled through a mouthful of meat. "You were right. The texture is incredible. A bit like venison, but richer," Jiao added, licking juice from her fingers. "Ambassador, you have to try this." Reed accepted a piece, her expression shifting from the stern diplomat to someone simply enjoying a good meal with her colleagues. She took a bite, chewed thoughtfully, and nodded. "Excellent, a credit to the chef and to the hunter." They were feasting. They had turned the symbol of Xylan harmony into a barbecue. Xyler could watch no more. He turned his back on the scene, a gesture of profound rejection. He and the other Lumina retreated to the far side of the pavilion, their lights a dim, sickened gray. Their silent, chiming conversation was no longer about diplomacy or trade. It was about re-evaluation, a fundamental reassessment of what it meant to be human. They were not just another curious, tool-using species seeking peaceful expansion. They were predators, apex predators who had carried their primal nature with them to the stars. They did not fear the dark spaces between worlds because they were, and always had been, the thing that lurked in the shadows. The diplomatic relationship had not been soured. It had been transformed. The Lumina now understood that they were not dealing with equals in philosophy. They were dealing with something far older, far more dangerous, and perhaps, in a terrifying way, far more vital. They were dealing with the galaxy's hunters, and the feast had just begun. In the weeks and months that followed the Feast of Predators, as it became known in classified Federation reports, the ripples spread far beyond Xylos. The complete sensory recording of the event, from the polite refusal of the Synth Prime to the final, greasy bite of roasted shimmerhide, was transmitted by Xyler to the Lumina High Council. From there, as was the custom in their open and logical society, it was shared with the other elder species of their galactic quadrant. The reaction was uniform and profound. On Cygnus X1, the silicon-based scholarks of the Crystal Fleets, beings of pure logic who saw the universe as a grand equation, ran the data through their predictive models. Their conclusion was delivered in a single, chilling edict to all their outposts. Reclassify Terrans. Threat potential, incalculable, primary drive, not acquisition of territory but consumption of biosphere. They do not merely conquer. They metabolize. Their models, which had always assumed that technological advancement led to the shedding of primitive biological imperatives, had failed. The humans were a fatal exception to the rule. They were a species that had weaponized its own biology, turning the primal need to eat into a driving force for cosmic expansion. The Session Assembly, a collective of gas giant leviathans who communicated through manipulated magnetic fields and considered themselves the galaxy's philosophers, contemplated the event for a full cycle. Their consensus, broadcast across the interstellar medium, was more poetic but no less alarming. The humans carry the fire in their belly. We have observed it in the hearts of dying stars, a force of chaotic consumption that creates new, complex elements from the ashes of the old. They are not a plague. They are a catalyst, and the galaxy as we have known it is the material to be consumed and reformed. For millennia, the established galactic powers had operated on a single, unspoken assumption, that all intelligent life, upon reaching a certain technological threshold, would naturally converge upon a shared philosophy of post-biological harmony. It was the great filter, they believed. Species that could not overcome their primal, competitive nature would inevitably destroy themselves long before achieving starflight. The Lumina, the Scholarks, the Sessions, they were the ones who had passed the test. They had become peaceful, logical, and predictable. Humanity shattered that assumption. They had not overcome their nature, they had perfected it. They had passed the great filter not by extinguishing their inner fire, but by building a starship around it. On Xylos, the diplomatic relationship with Ambassador Reed continued, but its character had irrevocably changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cautious, fearful respect. The Lumina no longer saw her as a peer, but as the smiling, articulate face of a terrifying force of nature. They were unfailingly polite, their adherence to protocol absolute, but their bioluminescence now held a permanent undercurrent of wary purple. Xyler met with Reed in the days following the hunt. The pavilion was still tainted with the faint, lingering smell of cooked meat, a scent the Lumina's atmospheric purifiers could not seem to fully scrub away. It was a constant reminder. "We have studied your history further," Xyler chimed, foregoing the usual pleasantries. "We understand now. Your entire technological ascent was fueled by this predatory imperative. Your first tools were for hunting and butchery. Your agriculture was the domestication and systematic slaughter of other species. Your sciences grew from the need to gain advantage, to be a more effective predator. Your art is filled with images of the hunt, of the struggle between life and death." "We do not deny our nature, Elder," Reed said calmly. She had anticipated this. "We see it as our greatest strength. It is why we adapt. It is why we survive. When our world grew cold, we hunted animals for their fur and learned to master fire. When we faced disease, we hunted the pathogen with our medicine until we understood and defeated it. When we looked to the stars, we saw the ultimate wilderness, and we felt the instinct to explore, to understand, to see what was over the next hill. It is all the same drive. Speak of it as if it is a virtue, Xyler resonated, the concept still alien to him. But it means you can never be satisfied. A predator is always hungry. You will consume your world and then you will seek others. You cannot live in harmony because your very definition of living is to dominate and consume. Definition of living is to strive, Reed corrected him. To struggle, to overcome. Harmony is a beautiful ideal, Elder, but it is a static state. The universe is not static. It is a place of constant, violent change. Stars explode. Worlds collide. Black holes devour galaxies. We are merely the first species you have met that is built in the universe's own image. Chaotic, hungry, and constantly creating the new from the destruction of the old. This became the new basis of their relationship. The Lumina, and by extension the other galactic powers, began to treat humanity not as a potential partner, but as a force to be managed. Treaties were drawn, but they were not treaties of friendship. They were containment strategies, couched in diplomatic language. Humanity was granted access to uninhabited worlds, but they were worlds with carefully catalogued non-sentient ecologies, worlds the elder races implicitly designated as feeding grounds. But the elder species were not interested in human technology, which they saw as brutishly effective but lacking elegance. They were interested in human biology and, more terrifyingly, human psychology. Lumina scientists requested cellular samples to study their rapid adaptability. The Scholarks paid dearly for access to human military strategists, wishing to understand the terrifying, non-linear logic of a predatory mind. The sessions requested human artists and poets, trying to comprehend the consciousness that could find beauty in struggle and nobility in death. Humanity, for its part, leaned into the new perception. Elia's thorn became something of a legend, the first hunter, a symbol of humanity's true nature. The Federation realized that their greatest diplomatic asset was not their reason or their technology, but their reputation. They were the monster in the closet of a galaxy that had forgotten what monsters looked like. And in a universe filled with unknown dangers, sometimes it was good to be the monster. Younger species on the verge of interstellar travel began to look to humanity not with fear, but with a kind of awe. They were the scavengers, the prey species, the ones who had lived for generations under the shadow of more powerful local predators. To them, the humans were not terrifying, they were an inspiration. They were proof that a species did not have to abandon its essential nature to reach the stars. They were proof that fangs and claws could coexist with faster-than-light travel. A new galactic schism began to form. On one side were the old, established, harmonious races who saw humanity as a dangerous anomaly to be carefully managed. On the other was a growing block of younger, more aggressive species who saw humanity as a model to be emulated. The galaxy, which had known a quiet, if distant, peace for millennia, was becoming a far more interesting and dangerous place. Ambassador Reed's tenure on Xylos eventually ended. On her last day, she met with Xyler one final time in the glowing pavilion. "We have learned much from you, Ambassador," Xyler chimed, his light a calm, contemplative blue. The fear had been replaced by a deep, philosophical resignation. "You have forced us to confront a truth we chose to forget. That peace is not the natural state of the universe. It is a fragile, artificial construct. It must be protected. And sometimes, its greatest protector is the perception of a strength too terrible to challenge. Hope one day you will see it not as a terrible strength, but simply as a different kind of strength," Reed replied. "We are not your enemies, Xyler. We are simply not like you," Xyler said. He looked past her towards the edge of the pavilion where Thorn had first stepped into the jungle. "Your chief Thorn. He is returning to your home world?" "He is," Reed confirmed. "A quiet retirement, he says. He wants to teach his grandchildren how to fish." Xyler's light flickered for a moment. The concept was still disturbing, but he understood it now. He understood that for humans, the act of teaching a child to hunt or fish was not an initiation into violence, but an inheritance of their identity. It was how they passed down the story of who they were. "Tell him," Xyler resonated after a long pause, "that the shimmer hides of Xylos now have a legend. A story they will tell their young of the day the silent, two-legged predators came from the sky. Your species does not just consume bodies, Ambassador. You consume narratives. You have written yourselves into the mythology of my world, a feat no other starfaring race has ever accomplished. It was, Reed realized, the highest compliment the Lumina could offer. They had not been conquered. They had been awed. As her ship ascended from the glowing surface of Xylos, Evelyn Reed looked down at the vibrant, phosphorescent jungle. She thought of Thorn teaching a child to bait a hook by a quiet stream on Earth, and of a young Shimmerhide on Xylos listening to a story about a dark arrow from a silent sky. The cycle continued. The hunt was eternal, and humanity was finally taking its true place in the galactic food chain, not at the bottom, not in the middle, but at the very top. They were the apex, and the galaxy, for better or for worse, was their new wilderness.